Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. On behalf of the John Adams Institute, welcome. Welcome Craig Strete, who came all the way from Salt Lake City with TWA. We told Craig that in the early 17th century, the Dutch bought Manhattan for only 60 guilders from the Indians. And that originated in this building, because here, this was the house of the West India Company. So we hope you don't have any hard feelings. You were there at the opening of a beautiful exposition we saw last Saturday. You wrote the introduction for the catalogue. The exposition was called Songs of the Shaman by our famous Dutch artist Gertie Bierenbroodspot, who is here tonight. Hello. Welcome Jan Meng. Jan Meng is a journalist and he has a radio program. He will introduce Craig and his work, and he will lead the discussion after the break. The break will be around 9 o'clock. Okay, thank you very much. Enjoy your evening. This, by the way, is the catalogue of Gertie's exposition. It's in Galerie La Haze until the 6th of December. There are the posters. Okay, enjoy your evening.
Well, I was raised good colonial. When I first met Indians, they were in The Lone Ranger and other comics. And my father told me about Indians, about their past and about their culture, but still the idea of Indians was to me something that I didn't know anything about really. It happened until the beginning of the 70s when I first read Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, written by D. Brown. And that really kept me thinking.
Can you speak louder, please?
Louder, please? Is it
Yeah.
possible? That's a good beginning.
Hey, oh. Is that, can I walk around with that if I have to?
Do you want to stand or you want to sit?
I want to stand. I probably want to.
Yeah, let's forget about the introduction, all right? You do your gig, all right? Well, I was just telling the front rows about D. Brown and my first, but everybody knows now, and I was really raised as a kid, you know, everybody knew about Indians. Indians were the bad guys and things like that. But when I first read D. Brown, Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, I was really flabbergasted, and I was also ashamed that I didn't know so much about Indians, really, about the life about Indians. And it was about 15 years ago, maybe longer, when Jos Knipscheer came to me in the bookstore where I was working at that time, and he told me about a book he was going to publish, about written by an Indian called Craig Strete. And he told me about the fact that he wrote pieces from Craig in the that he read pieces from Craig in the beginning, and then he had a correspondence with him, and then finally it came to the publishing of his book. And he said maybe it's a good idea that Craig Strete is coming over to Holland and have a signing session in your bookstore. And I realized then, well, God, it's the first Indian I'm going to meet. And it gave me a strange feeling, also a feeling of guilt that I didn't know so much about Indian culture. And there were so many Indian cultures, like the Cherokee and the Sioux and all the other tribes that you can mention. And then Craig came to me in the shop a year later, and he said, well, there's going to be no signing session whatsoever. I'm going to sit in your window and then start writing a book. Well, that sounded to me as a very good idea. And he came up one morning with his leather jacket on, the same as he's wearing now. Maybe not exactly the same, but yeah, a different one. But naked underneath, with his beautiful torso shown to the people. And I just had a table and a typewriter, and he started in the window. But you know how people in Amsterdam are. They don't mind, really. They really don't mind. I mean, he was sitting in a window every day for about 4 days, writing on his new book. What was then called Two Spies in the House of Love. But people kept asking him questions like, where is the Spanish department? And can you tell me where the alphabet begins? And things like that. So he was very distracted all the time. But anyway, it was a good experience. And then I started to read interviews with Craig, and I talked to him. And I read things as an Indian, I never fitted in. I'm Cherokee, and I've always lived in two worlds. That is why most of my stories deal with people who are trapped. Trapped in the mind, trapped between life and death, trapped in nightmares, trapped between reason and reality, and caught between two cultures. Craig Strete was born in Fort Wayne, Indiana, 1950. When his parents died, he was 7 years old, and he was raised in Los Angeles. He was raised by foster parents, and maybe that's why he's got such a good education. Is that possible? Then he became, in the 60s, the turbulent 60s came on, and he became a roadie plus a driver of a local rock and roll band. And then he met Jim Morrison from the pop group The Doors, the rock and roll group The Doors. He met Jim Morrison at an acid party, and they started together writing poetry and lyrics. And years later, he recognized lines he had written in lyrics that were sung by The Doors. And finally, what he started out to do in our window display, writing the book Two Spies in the House of Love, became a book, what was later published under the title Burn Down the Night, which is one of the most frantic books I've ever read about life in the 60s. You and me, they're really going to dig us when we're dead. You can hope to arrive without exile, zegt Jim Morrison. And Craig Strete has lived up to that. Isn't that so, Craig? I hope so. Yeah. The story I want to tell about the work of Craig is really, I tried to write down this morning, the last couple of hours before we came here. And I thought, well, heck no, I'm not going to try to write something which is in my mind, because it's also flat when it's written down. The thing that really got to me when I read Craig Strete's books is that is the inside struggle, the struggle of people living with their mind and conscience, living with death, living with a constant fear of meeting real people. He once wrote in a short story, it's always very dangerous to be with people who aren't there. And maybe that's one of the best things to describe the novels and books of Craig Strete. It's very dangerous to be with people who aren't there. I hope this night is going to be different. Thank you very much. Craig Strete.
Thank you. I have to kind of walk around. I'm sort of a restless spirit. I can't stay in one place. I just wanted to say the other side of that story she told about the Dutch buying Manhattan. We had already sold it to the Vikings. Sorry. I just thought I'd throw that in just to see if it fits. One of the interviewers asked me, insisted that I tell exactly what I was going to talk about. And I said, I had no idea. And she said, well, when are you going to think about it? And I said, the day after I give it, which is a kind of shaman's answer. I probably will think about it tomorrow. I'll say, gee, I should have said this, or I should have said that, or I should have talked about something incredibly strange and surreal, like shamanism. I said once at one point during an interview that I would talk about standing at the center of what you are not. That I would give some kind of explanation of what it's like to be a shaman. Joseph Campbell said, all writers should be shamans. High technology. Did it come unplugged? Yeah. I go fix it. Try it again. It works. It works. Maybe I better sit down. Wow. What was I saying?
Mike is not used to restless people.
Yeah, what was it?
The restless soul.
Joseph Campbell. I was talking about Joseph Campbell. Something about, oh yeah. This is a good moment. I was talking about that all writers should be shamans. That they should, actually, now that I think about it, I think I disagree with that in a way. I just sort of had a moment. Not in the sense that I don't really think if you surrender so completely to the world of the shaman, you can't come back. That shamanism is a very dark forest from which there is no return. That you can go on the path of a shaman only so far, and you can still come back. You can come back with a part of that other world, but if you go so completely into the world of the shaman, there is no coming back. Who you were, who you used to be, who you could be, all those things vanish. Shamanism changes you in a way so that you become entirely the vision that you seize. And in that way, I disagree. The manner of a shaman, the way of a shaman, you take a few days' journey on that path, then you can come back. But if you go as far as Don Juan went in the Carlos Castaneda novels, the point is that he did not become a shaman. He went on the path of a shaman. Don Juan himself could never have been a writer. If I myself were completely a shaman, I could never write. In effect, so in a way, I mean, Joseph Campbell is exactly right and exactly wrong.
The Mask of the Gods.
The Mask of the Gods. I think that's where the quote's from, isn't it? The one from the interview is from The Mask of the Gods. In some ways, shamanism is a curious addition to a writer's life. If you're trying to explore the world in a way and bring it back, it can add things to your repertoire that other kinds of writing, other kinds of experiencing doesn't add. Right now I'm writing a Vietnam novel. And as part of that journey, I taped about 1,000 hours of experiences from Vietnam vets, but only experiences that when they were drunk enough or drugged enough. Experiences that late at night, when the dark is very dark, they could actually talk about the things they could never speak about. The real horror, the real inner experience, the real terror, the real ultimate trauma that war always is. And in some sort of shaman's way, that's the kind of thing a writer's looking for. The things you can't say, things you can't really see, things you can't tolerate, the things that drive you mad, the things that sort of burn in the brain. Those are the kind of things the shaman deals with. the kind of horrors that are so intense that the individuals who experience them can't contain them, can't stand them, have to blot them out. There's a kind of annihilation of the spirit. Those are the kind of realities that the shaman drives at. I think I once said that if I were going to pick a goal as a writer, if I wanted to do just one thing, I would like to write a book that women would swear no man could write. That I had journeyed so far into the soul of a woman, they would swear that no man could ever have written it. It's a part of standing at the center of what you are not, of being male or female, or somehow surrendering to the other side of yourself, or a side that will never be yourself. In a certain sense, I'm not the most casual writer in a way, even though I have had lighter moments. But I think Truffaut said it once about me, although he was referring to me under another name in my all too long career as a film writer. He said that from a little piece of writing that I had done, and he's one of the few people in the film business who knew that I also wrote books under other names. He said that sometimes it seemed like in order to understand what I was doing, one had to sort of surrender to otherness, which is sort of a capsulization of how I sometimes feel about the whole process of writing, about submerging yourself into a world and letting the world become you in a way. I'll read something that is that kind of surrender. I don't always write that way. I don't always do that sort of thing. I've written lots of different kinds of things. I've written some of the most bizarre things that any writer could ever write. I actually can lay claim to having written a breakdance film, which is a signal honor, a kind of emotional cul-de-sac that I can't believe I ever... How could I sink so low, I said to myself. But writers find themselves traveling through very strange worlds all the time. Why an American Indian writer would end up writing a breakdance film or a martial arts film, I don't know. One of those strange journeys. I'll read a story that's as in some ways as close to a real traditional story. I always take like Indian mythologies if I use them at all, and sometimes I do, but I always twist them into some kind of mystery. You know, it's a mix and blend of personal mythology and that other world that's sort of temptingly always there. If I wrote a traditional Indian story, I think I would always reach for the darker side of the Indian spirit. Not by intention, not because I'm a gloomy soul, but because those kinds of stories always contain what for me is one of the most interesting aspects of being human. And it contains that idea of death, which I always find fascinating. For a person who hates war, I love death. And I find myself strangely compelled and endlessly fascinated whenever death enters the room. It seems to change the dynamics of every human relationship. In Indian culture, death is a friend. It's a fellow traveler. It's a very different kind of relationship with the world. I think one of the most interesting conversations I ever had in Europe once was with a Hungarian writer here in Amsterdam. When he would say something in Hungarian, his translator would retranslated into Dutch. She heard it in Dutch and turned around and said it to me in English. And then I spoke, and it was kind of this strange chain of being, back and forth. He told me an interesting story, which sounds almost Indian in a way. I mean, it's at the core of a kind of shamanistic kind of tradition, which is, he said that in the very old days, villagers would be married in a special set of clothes that would be used only once again when they were buried. And that kind of awareness of death at a time of great joy is very Indian in a way. And a lot of the power that I've always tapped into as a writer has been that relationship with death, which is subtly different than the sort of relationship white people have with death. White people tend to fear it, to flee from it, to disguise it, to hide it in certain ways. They certainly don't regard it as a friend, as something you embrace with rapture, which I do. I even said in an interview that I've already planned my own death, the manner of it, the style of it. It doesn't mean I'm suicidal. It's just that I actually can look forward to it because I think I can do it differently, right? I think I can go out with a certain kind of savoir-faire or whatever. Only Indians would take a certain delight in that. And I don't know if any of you have seen the film Little Big Man. There's a wonderful scene when Chief Dan George is sitting on the mountain, and he's gone there to die, and he thanks the four directions for everything he had in his life, and he thanks the Great Spirit for women and all the other joys of life. He's celebrating. He's actually enjoying that moment because the great mystery of his own life is going to be solved in some way. And that kind of celebration, that kind of strangeness that turns around reality, that death lies just beneath the smile, that birth is death and love is death and so on and so forth. All those real interesting transpositions all make, I think, writing real interesting. Death is interesting too. Let me read you a kind of lament in a way. It's about, actually all the stories in this book are about death in some way. Not intentionally. I didn't sit down one day and say, I'll write about death. It just was sort of an accumulation of things that all the stories, for some reason that I'm not really sure why, they all just somehow, maybe I was feeling triumphant, which is why I was sort of denying it or something. Anyway, this is a story called The Becoming of Wind River's Horse, which I have never read before aloud, but somebody wanted me to do it, so I'll give it a shot. Wind River died in a white man's prison in 1897. His wife died of starvation, waiting to receive the bones of the man she had loved. His bones were lost in a mass grave. She was buried somewhere, exactly where no one knew. It too had become no longer important. Their only daughter lived outside Fort Kearny, drank a lot with the white soldiers, and was dying slowly of bad whiskey and tuberculosis. The only thing left of the old days was Wind River's warhorse. His daughter vaguely remembered she had the horse, watered it when she remembered. Mostly it was turned out to graze, and she forgot it was around. The horse had no name. He was simply Wind River's horse, and he was dying. He had fallen sick. Because he had been a great war horse, the remaining survivors of the tribe said it would be bad medicine to kill him, even though his hide would make fine leather, and he would be very good in the eating pot. But honor was honor. They would not kill him. They were hungry always. But they did not think bad thoughts about the horse or blame him for taking too long to die. No one came to stroke his head or comb his long mane. No children leaned against his sides, dreaming of the days when they might sit astride a great wind with 4 legs. Only the vultures, black and ugly creatures with dark hearts, the color of their feathers, kept him company. Sometimes the dogs of the village came to see him, dogs he had joined in great hunts long ago. But their visits brought no comfort to Wind River's horse, for the souls of dogs are ugly with too much contact with men. Sick, alone, the horse lay on his side in the long grass. Nostrils quivering, he sniffed the wind, sensing danger, and struggled painfully, stiffly to his feet. Death was in the wind. The old warhorse felt it burning against his bones. He whinnied in terror, eyes dilated, nostrils flaring. He feared everything now, night most of all, because death was always so strong then, and the wind, the cruel wind, which seemed ever to have the smell of decay, tainting it with its sweet, acid sting. The old horse raised his head, trying to read the wind, and turned to run from death. Neighing long and shrilly, he tried to run. At his back from the hills beyond the village came a rustling and a humming and a scurrying. A black, loathsome thing, the smell of just such a thing as that, came to the old horse clearly on the wind. The horse bolted, the once proud war horse, legs churning as the old horse ran to outrace death. Now Wind River's horse thundered across the land like a bow-driven arrow, flashing the last rays of the setting sun. But the sun was in front of him, blinding him, outrunning him, seeming to be uncatchable life lived forever. And the old horse stumbled, and he nearly fell. His pace faltered, and his feet carried him off the great trail of war. And now the sun was behind him, and the old horse seemed to be racing headlong to meet death. In blind panic, the horse turned and ran again for the sun. To stop was to die, but to run further was to collapse from pain. Panic and a fear as cold as the grave urged him madly to run, but his tired old body was unable to obey. He stood motionless, a great, stunned, half-blinded thing. He lowered his head, and little by little, the fear subsided. The old horse came to himself again in the memories of the great hunts, the swift runs across the long grass and the full-legged glory of his youth. He remembered the stirring touch and warm presence of other young horses and the blinding heat of mating and fierce desire. He remembered the man who had ridden him, whose soul had been a part of his, whose triumph in life had been linked to his own. The good drove out the bad. The sweet, rich taste of grass, the blue, cool taste of running water. The good memories flooded in again, and death seemed farther away. Now the old horse felt strength returning to his scarred, time-ruined legs, and there awoke in him again a resistless desire to run, to thunder across the great fields of grass, forever chasing the sun, and also a desire to be one again with the man who had once ridden him in their shared glory. The horse seemed to know purpose now, seemed to understand that he must find Wind River once again, so that together they could ride out the approaching storm. And though he could barely stand on his own legs, though every step caused unbearable pain, the old horse began to run. If the man could come just once again and sit astride his back, or smooth his coat with one kind caress, gladly then he would lie down and die. But dying alone under a sky filled with blackbirds of death was too horrible. Blood splattered the ground, exhaled from his lungs in a red spray. His heart beat like the river rising against a dam. On he ran toward the dwelling of the man, not to die alone. Neighing piteously, the old horse stumbled into the village, seeking the lodge of the man. But a fence built by the white man barred his way. He pushed against the fence, but the rails were strong and did not give. In despair, he tried to bite the rails of the fence, but succeeded only in tearing his mouth. He tried to rear up to climb the fence, but his rear legs would not support him, and he fell heavily against the fence. And he leaned there, unable to go any further. The old horse's eyes swept across the village eagerly, seeking the man, but the village seemed deserted, dying as he himself was dying. The man wasn't there. Somehow the dying horse knew it. But where could he be? Wind River's horse shivered. His eyes rolled and his old body shook like a leaf in the wind. Each breath was like a knife scraping across his bones. His head sank until the damp grass touched his chin. A great thirst came over him then, and he wanted to lie down in water, to drink a river of it through his skin. A vulture landed on the fence with a sudden flap of wings. Wind River's horse found new strength and renewed terror. He backed away from the fence, staggering onward toward the tall spear rows of corn in the village garden. The grass, which had always been life to him, seemed now like the long green fingers of death, catching at his hooves, trying to pull him down to earth. Bushes seemed thick and unyielding, threatening to knock his legs out from under him. All the things of earth seemed to reach for his legs, to pull him eagerly down. The soul of the old horse fell deeper into despair. He staggered blindly on. The vultures flew silently behind him, keeping him in sight, coming closer and closer, sometimes landing just behind him, sometimes just ahead of him. His rear legs stiffened and began to drag behind him, and finally they failed him altogether, and he toppled sideways. The old horse thrashed on the ground, desperately trying to get back up. The vultures flew down from the trees and hopped along the ground, coming closer and closer. The long rows of corn bent in the wind and saw Wind River's horse with its many yellow eyes, and the old horse whinnied. Still closer came the vultures, sharpening their claws against the hard ground. Some flew overhead, circling nearer, almost touching the old horse's head. He struggled to rise, but his legs would not obey. He tried to push his hooves against the ground and dreamed he was up again, the man on his back, racing across the long grass with one great shared wild heart, man and horse, riding the long back of the big wind. Somewhere, a pile of bones stirred in the ground, shaking the tumbled bones of the many bodies buried there. A great wind seemed to go down through the earth, down deep enough to touch and move the bones of the old dead. Wind River's horse neighed savagely and snapped his teeth at oncoming death. And the wind from his mouth shook the bones of the dead. Wind River heard his old war horse, And as the spirit of one called to the spirit of the other, he tried to rise above the ground. But the weight of all the many dead weighed him down. Wind River's heart wanted to beat again, but there was too much death. His bones stirred, danced, and ached to join up again. But the other men's bones sent coldness and blackness and a despair so deep that it ate the wind that stirred the bones. And then Wind River's bones were still and would move no more forever. When River's horse felt the last wind leave his mouth, in that instant he knew the man was dead and gone. And then the old horse left the warpath. His hooves fell off into nothingness. The green eyes of the grass stared into the horse's staring eyes. The trees of night approached and reached out their sharp, claw-like roots for him. And the vultures came. The black nameless things that hum and whisper and scurry began to crawl across the old horse's body. The soul of the old horse rose up like smoke into the sky. On flashing hooves, it raced on a burning wind, seeking the man that once had shared that same great burning wind. But the wind blew cold, and from another direction now. It came not from the great forest beyond the trees of night, but from the spreading forest of tall buildings that housed the white man. It was a different wind, and it had the smells of another world in it. The soul of Wind River's horse grew cold, its legs stiffened, and its mane flattened against its side as the wind subsided. Like a leaf, the soul of the old horse fell out of the wind and grew cold and ceased to be and was seen no more.
Craig, you once said a wise Indian had to become a schizophrenic. Why is that?
Did I say that? No, I must have said that, I'm sure. A wise Indian has to be schizophrenic. A wise Indian. Not schizophrenic in a way, but many people. I once sat down with an old man, and he seemed really weary, and I said, "What's wrong? How's your bones?" And he said, "I'm very tired. I've been a small tree all day, growing in the shadow of another, and my roots have been strangled." It seems strange to me, in a way, that I wouldn't know that. I should have known that that was his problem, that he had been a tree all day, and a real shaman would have immediately understood that, wouldn't have had to ask that question. One of the great things about wisdom is that it means you are not just who you are. It means that you are in the process of becoming everything you see. If I sent you all out to see a tree, you'd probably come back in 20 minutes and tell me about it. But if an old Indian went out to see a tree, it may be weeks, months before he came back. And what he would see when he saw a tree and what you saw were totally different experiences. He might indeed be a tree whose roots were being strangled, who would live the life of a tree for a while. To him, that would be seeing. In that sense, it's schizophrenic, only it's not just people he would become. It's the whole world around him.
Is it a lack of spiritual world that white man has?
No, and they have a lot of spirit. It's the wrong kind of spirit. No. It's a totally different. It's a totally different dream, is what it is. There's very strangeness about being able to go between two worlds, to be white for a while and work in Hollywood and do that sort of thing, which is a very strange journey, and then to go back into the Indian world and live in a very different kind of moral and spiritual universe in a way. Not that you ever completely believe in any one of those worlds, because none of them are ever true. Truth isn't a part of the spirit world. It's appearance which changes, reality which is not ever fixed. That which you become today is not what you are tomorrow, and it erases itself in some way. That truth isn't something that you think about. It's not a spiritual quality. Becoming, existing, traveling, journeying, those are truths, but you never arrive. That's the whole secret of the shaman's journey, is that you never get there. You are always going in some strange way. So it's not just about spirit. That's a part of it, a small part of it. I mean, white people have spirits too, right?
Can you feel it? Here in this room now?
Yeah. Probably it's sitting back to the spirit saying, "You mean they sold it to the Vikings first?" No, it's a different, there are all these arcane disciplines like, the science of UFOs and what all those sort of things were. I'm not talking about spiritual auras or spirit presence or Kirlian photographs or that sort of thing. But there is a different sort of mindset, in a way, in the white world as opposed to the Indian world. And it could all be the same spirit, but it's a different tree. In some ways I can see connections between other cultures that are stronger. What's real interesting, I talked about this a little bit in an interview once, is that although Indians as a group had the widest cultural diversity and racial diversity of any other race, I mean, we basically covered 2 entire continents, from the top of North America, the Eskimos, all the way down to the tip of Terra del Fuego. And when you compare many of these different, very diverse groups, it's so much of us in some way impinges on some other part of us that's so radically different. I'm not so sure that there's that same kind of homogeneous sort of thing between disparate groups of white cultures. I'm not so sure that the Greek spirit and the Dutch spirit are the same. But I said once in an interview, it's amazing that the Eskimos and the Seminoles and the Cherokees and the Shawnees all don't understand the same things about the world. We have the same hole in the night. You know what I'm saying? It's not just that we don't all understand the same things, but the things we don't understand are the same. Does that make sense? I mean, it's a spiritual strangeness that we all share. I mean, Indians get together and even though some of us are traditional enemies and have been for 400 years, we all know that we don't know the same things. And we can get a kind of strength out of that. There's a shared sense of otherness. And we can all somehow fit together, even though we hate each other, which we often do. I'm not so sure that's true sometimes when I watch the white world, whether that's really true. There's a sort of, I think it's, you all misunderstand different things. Does that make sense to you at all? This is a shaman's guess at the world, I'm not sure.
You talked a lot about the shaman. do you feel as a shaman as a kind of in between?
In between worlds or in between betweens? I don't know. It's like that question about somebody was offered 3 choices and he asked which one and he said both. That's a real shaman's answer. I mean, you know, it is. Shamanism is all about moving from different planes of existence, of becoming absolutely what you aren't, in a way. Being between the worlds is standing at the doorway with one kind of reality in one hand and the other kind in the other hand. And what it's about is not choosing. If you make a choice, then you move in one direction. Then you're not between anymore. You're not touching both worlds. As soon as you decide for something, you move in that direction. It goes back to Aristotle's notion of primary motion. You begin to move. A shaman learns not to move. He learns to stand between. A shaman can look at a tree and see not the tree, but only the shadow of the tree. Because he doesn't choose. Can you do that? I can't do that. I've tried. I've stared at trees for days. All I got was a headache. You know, it's not that we, it's, you know, the problem with wisdom is that it actually requires you to be wise, which is not easy, by the way. One shaman asked me one time, he said, if you're really convinced that you want to walk this way, I will tell you when you're there. You have only to do one thing. I thought, even mystifying. Indians don't understand, even though we live it. Does that make sense? I'm even mystifying myself here. Anyway. Can we take questions?
After the break, I think.
Yeah? Okay.
Poetry? Yeah. You did do any, yeah? Yeah. I brought you some. Is it published in Dark Journey? No, it's a new one. Oh, it's poetic prose.
That was one of those. Actually, it's a real shaman's journey. They asked me to write something about something I had not seen, which is really, that's really standing at the center of what you're not, right? It's maybe it's better. This you want me to read? Do I take requests? I feel like a top 40 DJ. And now, the hits of the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Let it flow. Let it flow? I promised myself I wouldn't do any jokes. I did. I really swore that I would be serious and I wouldn't do any jokes at all.
What is the line Jim Morrison
Didn't actually steal it from me. I mean, shared, shared journey. It, he could use it, I could use it. I'm losing control. Anyway, not that I ever have any, actually. At one point, I thought maybe I should explain why I don't really have a formal speech. And I was going to say that I'd written one that my publisher had put it in the bottom of his cat box. And then the cat had read it, and the cat died. And it was too dangerous to do it. Anyway, I'm glad I didn't say that, though. The shaman is the eye behind the wind. His vision seizes the world through the eyes of his spirit helpers, eagle, hawk, all birds of prey. He is the ant in the grass hearing it grow, the eagle riding the thermals and speaking the language of wind and sky and night. He is the bone picker, the night walker. His is the unspeakable vision for which no human language exists. His dreams are understood in the catacomb of bone and skin, and they dance in the house of the dawn-breaking people, in the house of the lizard and reptile people. Balanced between dreams and visions, he seeks the loss of himself, becoming something more than human, and goes through the smoke hole to another world. There is a great mystery that brings him to this. For the shaman, there is no death, only a change of worlds. The world he sees and the world he lives in are not the same world. The shaman journeys outward, riding the ancestral wind, traveling in the minds and bodies of men and not men, and returns. Is it the same man who once walked the earth? It is a question even a shaman will not answer.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's now time for the shaman's choice, coffee or no coffee. Thank you. And welcome back. And it's now question hour. If people have some questions, please. Yes. Over there. One has to do with Indianism, you said? Indianist, yes. To who do you owe?
To whom do I owe my Indianness? Is that
Yeah.
that the question? I was born to it, I think, is the best way to say it. My father was a full-blood Cherokee. My mother was indeterminate.
So your father's blood is more important?
Well, actually, for the Cherokees, which are a matriarchal society, it would be better if my mother was Cherokee. I'd have more significance that way. It makes me a little less, in a way. The Cherokees value women more than men in many respects. So it would have been better if my mother had been, so on and so forth. Was that the question about Indianness, or was that the other one? Oh, you mean one? Well, one of the nice things about being Indian is that you can come and go and almost be a part of every tribe. The Indians are scattered all over America. There are more Indians living in cities than there are living on reservations, and they've all formed a sort of loose kind of tribes. I mean, we all become skins in a way, and as I grew up, I spent more and more time chasing my own identity, of re-emerging into that culture. And I left home fairly young and went back again into the hearts of Indian families and I know Ojibwe people and Shawnee and Cherokee, and I've sort of lived with them and been with them, and in a real lucky way. It almost in a way got to be more multi-tribal than someone who had grown up in one kind of tribe, one kind of place. In a sense, I got to be Hopi for a while and Navajo for a while, and it was really fascinating because I got the advantage, in a way, of not having to be in one place or in one heart. So I got to see many hearts, which I've used as a writer a lot. Somebody asked me one time about which reservation, the book I did called Paint Your Face on a Drowning in the River, which was also a play. And there are a lot of Indian friends I have who swear that it's their reservation. There's some Sioux to this day. I cannot convince them that it's not Pine Ridge. And it's bits and pieces of several reservations, some in the desert, some not. And because I have been with all of those different kinds of Indians, what I try to do sometimes is write an experience that is universal to all of them. You know, that touches not just the Cherokee heart, but the Cheyenne and the Sioux heart. You know, that same mysterious things we don't understand. You know, that thing, going back to that again, you know.
Does that answer your question? Yes? The other question over there?
Yeah. You just said that it was impossible as if you go on the road of shamanism, if you become a complete shaman, it's impossible to write. So obviously you stopped somewhere on that road.
Yes, I did. I actually was scared away. I did think about it once, and I went for a time to study with a holy man, and he absolutely scared the life out of me. I frankly admit it. I saw things that I did not want to see, and I felt whatever shred of identity that I hold slipping away. It was truly a thing for someone greater than myself. I feel in some ways that I was not up to it as an experience. And as the longer I journeyed, the scarier it got. I still, to this day, have some nightmares about that moment of time, the things that I saw that I still can't actually talk about, in a way.
There are some, as I heard before, there are some Jim Morrison fans in the room here. So maybe we could plunge into the 60s by this. Are they, or is it something you don't want to talk about anymore?
No,
Greg?
It's like, could I unlive that part of my life?
No, that's right. You connected yourself in this book, Burn Down the Night. Let's go a little bit further back to the 60s, maybe in the beginning of the 60s when you were a roadie, and let's tell us an anecdote that you were saved by a Saint Bernard.
Saved by a Saint.
And do you remember that? When you were a roadie and stoned and drugged in a van with no driver's license and lots of booze.
Gee.
Shall I tell the anecdote then?
You tell me the story, because you remember it better than I do.
Well, you picked up a girl. Well, there was a girl in the group you were driving with, and she had a Saint Bernard, and they were both on LSD. Remember that?
Oh yeah. It's only in the book. Why should I remember it? I don't know. Well, actually, probably why I can't answer that question is because I really wrote that book to forget about the 60s.
Yeah, that's right.
It's kind of a cleansing of the spirit in a way to say, yes, let's get rid of that. I don't know. It's like talking about a Saint Bernard seems like a plane of existence I can't get to anymore. I don't. That seems to be someplace else.
Is that what really happened to you when you wrote this book, Burn Down the Night? It really went all away?
You mean as far as
as your memory is concerned?
Well, no, it hasn't totally left me. I still remember who I am a little bit from those days, vaguely.
Who can forget a Saint Bernard who was on LSD?
Well, that was the most normal person I met in the 60s, actually. It's kind of strange, kind of
The story is that the Saint
practically a totem for me in this day and age. I often think back on that St. Bernard and say, God, if only I could ask him a few more questions. Originally, I should say this, I not only was a roadie, I was a musician as well. And from like 1965 to 1971, that period of dark madness, which I surrendered to, was probably for me the kind of experience that I hope never to have again. And I wrote originally about 1,000-page book when I wrote Burn Down the Night. And the actual end of this particular book is the middle of the book. What happened actually was I decided to really do the 60s in a way, and I think I did. If anyone could ever see the entire book, you know, what happened after what happened here.
Why was it never published entirely?
I took it to a very sharp lawyer who is a real specialist in you know, the kind of litigation, the results when you use real people about real things. And they began taking parts of the book out, saying, well, you know.
You mean your lawyer took part out of your book?
Yeah. Initially, he took a big chunk out and said, these people are still
What a
alive.
way to make a living.
There's no statute of limitations on murder. Let's not include this in the book. They'll sue the something off of you. So I didn't. So I took some out, and then I thought, well, you know, I had to. When you took one section out, you had to take another section out. And before you knew it, it went down to about, I think, 350 pages was the final, something like that. There were 750 pages in a vault, that my lawyer, when I die, they'll just maybe bring it out. I hope I don't die. I don't want to see the other 750, but it just got a little too complicated in a way.
Yeah.
So I always felt maybe that it was better that way. Although the book sort of changed and shifted when a lot of it was gone, and it got a little smaller. And I just never talked about the rest of it because it was, I think, better forgotten.
When you die, you said. You have any idea when you're dying? Because for an Indian, you're very old. The average Indian in the United States the average age is about 36 years old.
I think the life expectancy is 36.
Yeah.
Something like that.
Why is
so
that?
for me, I'm ancient.
Yeah.
At 41.
How is it possible?
Alcoholism, drugs, the highest infant mortality rate of any other group. So most Indians don't make it to 20. And the same was true of my own people as well.
Yeah.
They died very young, in their 20s. So.
He also wrote once that you didn't expect to live up to 24.
Yeah, that's a big surprise for me.
Big surprise for all of us.
That's why I'm not a shaman, right? I should have figured this out. If I had known that I was going to live this long, I wouldn't have broken so many bones and you know, all that physical damage that I sustained in the process. I figured, I'm not going to use this later, I'll just break it now. So,
back to Jim Morrison. A lot of people criticized you using Jim Morrison's name for your own good, about publishing the poetry together with Jim Morrison.
Well, actually, his estate wanted half the rights to the book, which I freely granted them at one point. I was unaware that I had been criticized for using his stuff. Well, the American press was not too thrilled with the book. And in the other portions of the book, a lot of the rest of the book is not about Jim Morrison. It just, since he was dead, they could leave that in. So it got a little shifted and changed, and it became, I thought it was a novel about the 60s, for me. It was the rock and roll experience The fact that Jim Morrison was someone I knew and I used him was not a, do you know what I'm saying? It wasn't supposed to be a book about him.
No,
That
the
was the
publishers, the
deal.
paperback publishers, used it as a kind of double bill, together with a book by Jerry Hopkins, No One Here Gets Out Alive.
Yeah,
Because it has
exactly.
also
It was a kind of
mainly
sledgehammer.
the same, yeah, the same.
If you
cover.
like No One Here Gets Out Alive, you'll like Burn Down the Night.
Did you like No One Here Gets Out Alive?
I never read it, actually, until about, I had read it something like a year after this one, or a year after the fact, or something like that.
Yeah.
But mine took at least 2 years to find a publisher, and then it took them 18 months to publish it. So it was one of those strange kind of, and I think theirs was out for about a year and a half.
About a year and a half. Yeah,
before mine, something like that.
yeah, cloth edition. The
Yeah.
cloth edition, yes. The
Yeah.
paperback came, a
Yeah,
few months
well,
after each other.
true.
During those days that you met Jim Morrison, then you were studying film at that time?
Later. That was later, when I got sane.
Yeah.
When
But you were writing then, and I told you in the introduction that you met Jim at an acid party, and then
1965.
1965. Yeah.
I was 15, going on 30, sort of. One big jump. Film school
And
was...
when did you? We'll talk about film later. When did you actually became in a position to talk with him and make lyrics together? And how did it happen?
The summer of '65 in Venice, I was hanging out, as one says it. I was in an altered frame of mind, I believe. To be kind about the '60s, I occasionally, not that I ever took drugs.
Never.
Not that I ever did. But I knew people who took drugs, and I could pretend to be them for a while, and something like that.
Yeah.
No, it was a just sort of loose time when everyone was sort of gravitating towards the West Coast. And I, like a lot of other people, sort of floated up on the shore, this was before Jim Morrison was
The Jim Morrison.
the Jim Morrison. And who knew,
Yeah.
right? No one knew. It was about a year before the Doors got together in '66 or something like that.
Yeah.
Right in that period. I mean, it's real hazy. I mean, exact days are hard to remember.
I don't mind.
It was Tuesday at 5
Yes.
o'clock.
Talk about film. You studied film and you wanted to be a director to show the people what Indians were really like, to make a picture, make a movie picture, and then to show the real life of the Indians. And later on, you worked in the film industry and was rewriting scripts, nothing to do about Indians.
No, not about Indians. No, when you do breakdance films, they're not about Indians.
No, that's right. Well, maybe you can say, some people can say that breakdance comes from the Indians.
Yes, it is a form of Indian
Yeah.
dancing. Yes. No. Actually, I never really intended to be a writer, which is one of those strange ironies. I wanted to be a film director, and writing was an absolute, the wrong thing, in a way. I had actually lied my way into a film directing job when I was like 22 or 23, something. I was still in film school. I told them very glibly that I had directed films in Europe, which I had never seen. Well, that's very clever. And about halfway through the film, they ran out of money. And I had seen it coming. I knew it was not going to succeed, but I had done everything to try to keep it alive. And so I was working 18-hour days, and I did the stunt work myself because we couldn't afford it, doing all sorts of crazy things. And then when the film collapsed, I went nuts. I had nothing to do, and I was awake all the time. And I tried painting, and people who have seen me paint say I don't paint. It wasn't particularly successful. And then I thought, well, I have access to a Xerox, I have a typewriter, I'll do a magazine. I'll edit a magazine. Not that I was going to write. No, I was just going to edit it and look wise beyond my years. You know, one of those mysterious transfer. But I had all these Indian friends, and they had these incredible visions inside them. And I felt that I would try to give them a place for all those incredible things that they were experiencing. That was really my intention, that I would bring something new in there. I would just give them a place for that. And it was long on theory and short on actual delivery. I mean, what happened was no one would write for me. And the time came and went when the magazine was supposed to be out. This whole story ends up with how I came here, by the way.
Yeah, that's right. And then you were contacted by a Dutch publisher who said, I'm going to make you famous in Holland.
No. He said he's going to make me famous in France. No,
Yeah.
That's not true. What happened was I could not get anyone to write for me, and so I wrote the entire magazine myself under different names.
Yeah.
And those same stories, and I did like 5 or 6 issues of this magazine pretending to be all these different people. That same set of stories became the first book that this madman first published 15 years ago, which somehow brought me all to this.
Dames en heren, 15 jaar uitgeverij in de Knipscheer. Dat is toch wel iets om even voor te applaudisseren. Dat vind ik wel. During those days, there was also something going on in the world. The Vietnam War. You were one of the protesters then? Against the war?
Yes, actually I did.
And now you're writing a novel about it, and your last novel also features a Vietnam veteran.
Yeah, in a way.
Like everybody else, did your view alter during the times?
Not the reason why I hated. I mean, I've always hated war. That's not a,
No.
you know, that never. That's a constant that never changed. But I'm not, you know, I have no political. I'm not writing this novel as it has no politics in it.
It's not politics that we're talking about.
No.
I'm talking about a feeling of guilt, maybe.
About the war?
Yeah. About you protesting, and over the last, say, 10 years, what we see now in movies and in books is that not people glorifying the war, but seeing the war as it happened for the normal foot soldier, for the people who were your age, my age.
Well, actually, I'm doing a kind of strange thing. I'm trying to redo the war as an American Indian experience in a way, and I'm sort of making a very strange journey back into the tribal Vietnam the white man never saw. And in a sense, what I'm trying to do with this new novel, which is just the most awful thing I've ever had to live through in some ways. The rock and roll novel was hard for me to write. It was a nightmare. It just went on for days and days, and I walled myself in a room and wept and cried and sort of suffered, but it was understandable pain, tolerable pain. The Vietnam novel, like sort of re-experiencing the ultimate horror that other members of my generation experienced, is much harder, much more awful. The night is much more dark. What I'm trying to do is figure out how a whole generation could have moved to slaughter. You know, how they could have been led there. You know, what's the reason for madness? You know, there is a reason for it. There is a cause. And I'm in some ways trying to reinterpret the whole experience as a tribal thing, as a, you know, exploring the reasons why they could not win this war. And you know, I'm sort of re-examining the whole nature of the reality that they thought was there. It's sort of my theory that they were in a Vietnam they could not see. But they actually walked across the face of a land they didn't understand. There used to be this strange dichotomy that the Vietnamese, it was said that the Viet Cong ruled the night and the Americans ruled the day. And that was that deeper truth, because they couldn't really see the place they were in. And what ultimately defeated them was this cultural truth, this thing called the land, in a way. Because they were fighting a war for the minds and hearts of the people. And that's something that can't be conquered in any way. The land can be. If you seek to possess the land and put your spirit into it, you can win a war. It's the only way you can win a war. It's the only way you can start on the East Coast and go all the way to the West Coast and steal a continent, because you want to put your spirit into it. So this novel I'm doing is, in a sense, that's what I'm doing with Vietnam in the 60s and the whole world.
And you're coming back to a theme that you use very often, that living in two worlds.
Exactly, yeah. And you know, it's strange. I mean, there's a really odd parallel in a way. You know, I said a lot of Indian cultures are very same and very different, and so on and so forth. But some of the pre-tribal cultures of Vietnam are very Indian in a way. That the ancient Cham culture is a very Indian culture in a sense, and it was really the inner spirit of the Vietnamese that the Americans didn't understand. They so totally misunderstood the culture, in the same way the Russians misunderstood Afghanistan. I mean, the French made the same mistake in Indochina.
You mean the same mistake all over again, like they did 200 years ago, 300 years ago in America? White man against Indian.
No, but the white men didn't make a mistake when they conquered America. They didn't make a mistake. They won that one. But the French made the same spiritual mistake that the Americans made in Vietnam, that the Russians made in Afghanistan, is that you really can't quell the spirit in a land unless you want to possess it, unless you want to replace one spirit with another. I mean, that's the kind of, you know, it's not just guerrilla warfare that's hard to beat. You know, and if you don't possess the spiritual center of the place, you can't win it. Unless you can annihilate everyone and win it that way. But, do you know what I'm saying? There was this strange pattern that I saw not only there, but other places in the world. And that's that kind of pattern that I'm looking for in this novel, this sort of replay of the experience in a way that says this is a universal mistake. Does that make sense? I mean, I don't know. I'm talking about something that's 400 pages long and 9 miles deep for me.
Yeah.
But it's a strange surrender of the senses too. As a writer, even though I love death and I love the sensation of it in a way, and I've always felt somehow compelled to confront it in a way, and even risk it at times, because it just makes life incredibly intense and interesting. And there is a fascination about it. But war has a different kind of death. Real primal death, an ugly death. Even a death you can almost fear, because it isn't understandable in a way.
But most Indian nations were also very much war-going nations.
Historically, the principal occupation of the Cherokee was war. We're talking about the old Cherokees. But war was fought for a different reason. It was not so much the ultimate goal was not always to kill. It was sometimes to win honor. It was sometimes to establish a sense of oneself. And it wasn't always about extermination, which these kinds of wars are. Different kind of war.
Maybe it's time for some few questions now, maybe? Yes? Influenced by Scott Momaday and Silko.
In some ways, I'm influenced by everyone and everything. What really happened, what got really interesting was that there was an older generation of writers, and those are writers like N. Scott Momaday and Oliver Lafarge and a few people before, but they're very isolated, and it was a very strong traditional sense out of which they wrote. More they wrote in a tribal voice. And then there was this sort of strange outswelling in the 70s, and suddenly this entire wave of Indians who began to write out of a mixed personal mythology, like Leslie Silko and James Welch and Simon Ortiz, and a number of other writers who all suddenly began to master the novel. And in the sense that they were all pioneers and blazed, paths in the night which we could all follow. They influenced us all. Because they really were important books and important kind of territorial markings in a way. Because it was the first really strong wave of mixed individual mythology and the traditional story. Because if anything, what I am as a writer is someone who has gone one step further from the traditional story. I do traditional stories, but somewhat differently. And the same way I think Leslie Silko as a writer and painters like Fritz Scholder, I don't know if you're familiar with him, has sort of translated the next phase, almost like the next face. I mean, Indian writing was very infrequent. We always did it alone. Most of the writers were very isolated and never had other ones to sort of bounce off of in a way. And then suddenly, wonderful writers like Silko and Welch began writing these incredible novels that sort of make it easy for us to also make personal journeys as writers in a way.
But did it influence you? That was a question. In your writing, did it change your own writing?
It strikes me that both Silko and Scott write about war too. They write about the Second World War. Indians who come back from the war and are really alienated from their tribes and try to come back to their own culture. And somehow you're talking about the same thing, it seems to me, but only in a larger.
Well, well, in the sense that it's a shared world. In a sense, I mean, we all draw on the same. I don't know how to say it. It's the same tree, somehow. I'm not really sure, but as far as a direct influence, I mean, nothing that I wrote changed because of anything they wrote that I'm aware of, which doesn't mean that it didn't happen. I'm, you know, it's really strange. You know, somebody says, like, what's your favorite writer? And I never know. I've never been able to tell because I read 3 books a day almost every day of my life. And I'm an omnivore. I will read literally anything. And when you've read thousands and thousands of books, everything influences you and nothing. It becomes this strange, synergistic, you know, 10,000 voices. And I'm not sure when I'm writing if I am me or a little bit of them or so on. You know, I might be someday talking with Leslie Silko's voice in a character and not be really aware of it. That's, you know, that's very likely. Or that I might have an atmosphere or a mood or something that came out of James Welch. That's extremely possible. And likely sometimes, but it's very unconscious, you know? It's not a directed experience, in other words, if that makes sense.
We come to a point now that the oral tradition, which is the basis of maybe Indian stories, Indian fiction. How is it possible that you were raised by foster parents, which are white? Weren't they white?
Yeah.
Yeah. That they didn't tell you any stories, so you were not raised by an oral tradition. Did you feel that you missed that?
You mean, are you asking about my foster parents, their traditions, or what?
Yeah, but because you were 7 when your parents died, and as I understand, in Indian life.
But you don't have to be, you know, I mean, most Indians do not even speak their own language. And it isn't a connection about language so much, or even, you know, it's not something that you can only learn when you're young. It's something you can experience at any point in any time of your life. I mean, the fact that it was there and I could go there later, you know, that I surrendered a part of me to oral tradition and learned in a little way. I mean, you can't break away from the tradition until you understand it. Does that make sense? I mean, what I'm saying, if I say I'm going to take one step farther away from the tradition, it's only because I think I understand it now. That in some strange way, I became an oral storyteller and then went beyond it.
Did your foster parents simulate that, or didn't they do anything about your culture?
No, nothing.
Nothing.
Nothing. None of it came from there, which is why I left.
We're talking more about a spiritual tradition more than an oral tradition.
Yeah, it's all, you know, it all comes later. It's a different part of the wheel, in a way. I mean, and storytelling has changed a lot. It's really, the old oral tradition is still alive, but it's very changed. I mean, the stories are not so much about telling house stories or how it became, or creation stories. I mean, it used to be an Indian would tell his life story, and he might start at the beginning of the world, which makes sense to him. That was the way you told the story of your own life. You started with the creation of the world, and then you might work backwards or forwards, or you might skip, and you might tell the end first. And this is what it was like when I was getting ready to die and I was old and no one loved me. And then 5 minutes later you're talking about being born. And when I was born, you know, it rained like hell and whatever. I mean, it's that kind of discontinuity. But the rhythm of all that has changed a lot. Not that the sequence would be any different. It might still be from the back to the front or from the middle to the end, but the cultural context has changed. So that it's not the old traditional stories, in a way. New stories, new myths.
But
The
is it,
Leslie Silko stories, the James Welch novels, those are the new oral traditions in a way.
isn't it true that a lot of the Indians don't know really what their traditions are, and they tell stories, white man stories, which is also involved in their culture again? What white man wants to see about the Indians, what the Indians give them, like they sell plastic moccasins in the reservations and things like that.
I mean, like the old. I know what it was like to be an Indian because I saw it in a movie, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
I once thought that I should teach a course in how to speak Hollywood Indian.
Yeah. White men speak with forked tongue.
That's right. Is this thing fading away or something? This sounds strange to me. Somebody once said it was really good that anthropologists had arrived because now Indians could hear an explanation of who they were. Indian is not a real definable truth. It is not a. It is not. It's like somebody said to me, well, if you can tell me what an Indian is, I'll tell you what a white person is. I'll explain white culture to you if you can explain Indian culture to me. Could you, could any of you explain your culture to someone else?
No.
I can't go beyond sometimes who I am this week. Let alone, and the same is true for Indians. We are all very much confused about our identity. Sometimes because for many of us, we've had a break in the traditions. There's a break in the generations. Some Indians live in very closely knit families where the generations are still together. But for most of them, they're broken. And I've written about that breaking of the generations, that age-old struggle that happens when the old and the young no longer live in the same house. And that's a real problem too, because what would have got passed along gets changed. It becomes something Indian but different, You are no longer your grandfather. You are some other version of your grandfather. Some sort of other world affected you in some way. Does that make sense? Read something again? I could. Should I?
I guess time is up almost.
I could if I...
I love to hear something from you anyway.
No. No, I would hate to be held up as a model of behavior for anyone or anything, or even a spokesperson. Sometimes I'm afraid to speak for myself, actually.
I think time is up, right?
I'd like to ask you one question that came to mind. You read us a story about a horse that died, and you talk about justice, something you write about it, and you give very lively descriptions of the pain in his body. I'm talking about the horse now, and blood pouring out of his mouth. Somehow it makes me feel that you were trying to deal with their own fear of death by becoming its friend. Is that?
Actually not. I mean, I'm not really afraid of death. Not.
No, you told me that, but I'm trying to find out how you
When I wrote that story, the only thing I was trying to do was be a horse. And to go through that experience as that horse living that experience. That was it. And what happened to me, I mean, it's a very strange thing. What I do sometimes is I create a character, and it might be a horse, and it might be a man, and it might be a woman, and all I do is walk along beside them. I don't know where they're going. It's just was happening to me. How would I react to the experience? Would I move? Would I feel the grasp that it used to be life itself reaching up to pull me down? Do you know what I'm saying? I was looking for things that would betray me in the world I knew. I was looking for familiar things, familiar to a horse, from the eyes of a horse, all those kind of things. It was just that thing, not anything else.
One question, please, because we have to end. You, please.
I would love something about that holy man who went to study with him. How old were you when you stayed with him?
How old was I when I went to study with a holy man? I was about 22, 23, something like that. 20? No, maybe younger. I have no idea.
How do you meet a holy man when you are 23? And you said that the experiences were so frightening that I wonder if you're telling us about shamanism, and I wonder if it's a process of trying to become a wise person, why does this holy man accept you to come with him and study? Because in my very, very narrow view, it doesn't seem very responsible, you see, to take someone so young to come with you and share very, very these kind of experiences.
The proper age to start would be about 4. If you were going to really just surrender to the life of a shaman, 4 years old is the right age. To do it that late in life was actually a small honor accorded to me, in a way, which usually, if you're going to do something like this, you're chosen very young, or you're a part of it, or so on. It's hard to explain the context in which one sometimes travels. I mean, it's a very long, complicated story about how you get there sometimes. But it's something you do when you're very young. And it is based on things that I don't understand. Why you're asked, why you're not asked, why you can go, why you can come, I don't know. They don't tell you why. They don't explain things to you. And sometimes what they do explain to you scares the hell out of you, or it just totally mystifies you. I mean, you're taught, I don't talk a lot about it, but you're taught 2 things, that there are 2 sides. There's an ally on the side of life and an ally on the side of death. And you can move towards one or the other, and you'll stand between both. And that you'll have help from one side or the other. What scared me was the strongest force in my life was on the side of death, which meant that I would have been I would have had a very strange journey. Do you want to take that one?
Yeah.
Well, I think you can say it. I think an Indian chief said it best when he described what happened when the white man came. He said, "They looked us in the eyes and saw only our land."
That's a good answer. I think, ladies and gentlemen, that's about it for tonight. Craig Strete, thank you very much. All his books are available. Most of his books are available by publishing house In de Knipscheer, and they're for sale in all the bookstores.